Voilà, je me présente rapidement. J'ai fait une thèse sur la finance islamique avec Dominique de Courcelles. Et suite à ma thèse, je m'intéresse au surendettement. Lors d'un déplacement aux États-Unis dans la ville de Saint-Louis, dans l'État du Missouri, des publicités ont particulièrement retenu mon attention. Certains panneaux Quick Cash, Instant Tax, une rhétorique qui n'inspirait guère confiance, et à cette observation d'une rhétorique qui ne pouvait qu'être mensongère, s'ajoutaient les couleurs utilisées pour le marketing apparenté au marketing des chaînes de fast-food, des couleurs primaires qui flashaient du jaune, du rouge, parfois des guirlandes, des néons pour solliciter notre attention, et le tout j'observais dans un décor lugubre au sein d'une misère visible, des locaux peu entretenus et la pauvreté visible des clients s'y présentant. Mes études sur la finance islamique, où l'intérêt financier est clairement interdit, cette industrie du payday lending, que je n'arrive pas à traduire à ce jour en français, mais dont nous expliquerons brièvement les mécanismes et le contexte de pauvreté dans lequel elle se greffe, m'a paru d'une absurdité sans limite. Pourquoi? Les payday loans sont des prêts d'une somme qui, aux États-Unis, est aux alentours de 500 $ ou moins, avec un taux effectif global, un taux d'intérêt d'une moyenne de 450%, et légal jusqu'à 1980% dans l'État du Missouri, et qui vise en particulier la population pauvre africaine-américaine. La démarche de marketing que j'observais m'intriguant, j'ai commencé à me renseigner auprès de différents amis dans la ville de Saint-Louis afin de rencontrer, si elle existait, une personne qui pourrait m'expliquer le fonctionnement délirant de cette industrie. C'est à ce moment que j'ai fait connaissance de Romona à Saint-Louis, à qui je laisse la parole.
It's truly an honor to have this opportunity to sit among such prestigious scholars, religious leaders, and experts on economic justice. I am humbled and thankful to share our story on this international platform, and I bring greetings to you from the north side of St. Louis, Missouri. I haven't the words to express my deep gratitude to Dr. Dominique, the foundation, the organizers, and my dear friend and sister, Anne-Sophie, for making this opportunity possible. I am forever humbled and grateful to you both. In the spirit of Dr. Martin Luther King, I say injustice anywhere is injustice everywhere. Possibly some of you have heard about St. Louis, Missouri, and know of the infamous arch known as the Gateway to the West and the East. 2014 marks the 250th anniversary of this great American city, and there are lots of celebratory activities underway that will last throughout the year. Gala affairs will blanket the region in honor of this monumental event. However, there is a dark side of St. Louis that visitors seldom have the opportunity to experience, which my dear friend, Professor Hillary Etzer of Fordham University coined Beyond the Arch, after she toured north of Del Mar for the first time following the American Bar Association's Equal Justice Conference, where I presented in May of 2013. You see, north of Del Mar is where I live and work. However, our quality of life has been intentionally, systematically, and strategically diminished. To understand the significance of north of Del Mar, it is necessary to give you a brief synopsis of this area of St. Louis. Del Mar Avenue is known as the imaginary Mason-Dixon line that separates whites from blacks, the affluent from the oppressed poor. According to the 2010 U.S. Census, north of Del Mar is 98% African American, median incomes are below the U.S. poverty level, and the subsequent quality of life indicators are reflective of that census data. The New York Times recently published a front page article on gun violence in North St. Louis. The French Department of Foreign Affairs issued an alert to tourists to steer clear of my community. Unfortunately, What is overshadowed and seldom discussed is the egregious institutional and structural racism that has festered for decades and the root cause of the conditions that Anne-Sophie and I will present at this time.
This is a short video to show the context in which payday lending thrives.
There's one street corner in North St. Louis where there hasn't been a shooting in years, and it's because people who live and work in the area are reclaiming their neighborhood. New at 10, News Channel 5's Lisa Zigman explains how they're accomplishing what police and politicians couldn't.
I love her.
This great-grandmother
Well, Mr. Woman, she's the queen of North St. Louis.
would never consider herself
Hey!
the queen of anything. But on the corner of Althone and Carter, in one of the toughest parts of our region, an idea for peace has grown into something amazing.
One corner at a time, as Rabbi Talby said. We will reclaim one corner at a time.
There hasn't been a shooting near this corner in 4 years, and that is saying a lot.
It was like a Wild Wild West, I would say. It was very dangerous.
Zudi Masri has owned Yateman's Market on this corner for 32 years. He knows most of the young men who died near his store. But the young man who died in his arms in 2009 was the final blow.
We swore that there's going to be the last one around here.
Zudi mobilized and organized gang members and basically called for a truce.
How were you able to do that?
Love.
Love.
Love. I love those guys, and they listen to me.
What police and politicians couldn't do, Zudi and Ramona did. With the help of Reverend Otis Bryant, Rabbi Susan Talby, and Imam Adil Imdad, and those who live near this corner, peace has come.
Every day I think about what I can do in order to make this neighborhood in the north side of St. Louis a better place to live. I think about that every day.
Right, I use the pack of gun for my safety.
Mr. D, as he's known around here, was one of the gang leaders called to Zudi's table to help bring about the peace. Like 60% of the men in this area, he is unemployed, but says he wants to work.
I actually wanted to be a motivational speaker to where I come back into my community and be able to try to better it in a different way and tell the children that the streets ain't the only option that they have.
And that takes us back to this great-grandmother, who started an organization called M-Slice, which led to a project called Eye of the Sparrow. She's brought together those who live in the neighborhood with business leaders and professionals to help reclaim more street corners.
It is just an honor to be able to express and to share a different side of who we are in the north side of St. Louis.
Lisa Zigman for News Channel 5.
Merci. Est-ce qu'on peut aller à la diapo 4? So I'm going to very briefly introduce payday lending. So payday loans are short-term, high-interest loans made to keep consumers returning back to the store, paycheck after paycheck. When someone is desperate to pay utilities, desperate to pay the rent, or buy food, or pay for medical expenses, and they have very little on their bank account, they turn to payday lending. Payday lenders do not do a credit history check, but they request pay stub and the pay date from the client to know when the client will get paid and the client's pay date. They'll want to access a recent bank statement so that they can see if the client has a regular salary or job, and that the client will get a payment in maybe 2 weeks. The client is asked to write a check, not for $500, But for every $100 borrowed, the payday lender wants 25% interest. That is 25% interest per 2 weeks. That's not per year. This is different to the effective annual percentage rate. So if a client borrows $500, they have to give back the $500 in 2 weeks, plus $25 for every $100. And if the client borrows $500, they have to write a check for $625 to the payday loan shop and forward date the check by, for instance, 2 weeks from the day that they borrow the money. The payday place will not cash in the check immediately, but will keep the check. When the payday hits, they give the client the option to either bring $625 in cash, and then they give back the check. And if the client does not show up, the payday place will just cash in the check that was left. So the payday loan store ensures that it has access to the client's paycheck before the person can pay their utilities or food or other necessities. May I add that if the consumer chooses to close their bank account before the loan is paid, the payday lender cannot, so that the payday lender can't withdraw the $625, they risk being prosecuted because a bounced check of $500 or more is prosecutable. So technically, the person getting a payday loan pays $25 for every $100 for 2 weeks. If we look at a simple annual percentage rate that takes 25% times 26 2 weeks periods that year, that's an APR of 650%. That's way above what credit cards charge. But the effective annual percentage rate, if you let it compound, is 1.25 to the 26th power, and we get 329 times $500. And if it compounds at this rate, without rolling over the principal, that's about 3,300% after a year. That usually doesn't, usually the money is not compounded this way, but effectively this is what it amounts to. So payday lending is just one of the many predatory financial practices that plague the low wealth and people of color in the US. There's a quote attributed to Publilius Syrus that debt is the slavery of the free. And this resounds quite strongly in this predominantly African-American neighborhood, where the ghosts of the past continue to plague African Americans in the US. We may ask if this financial practice is a form of modern-day slavery, of economic slavery, that continues to exploit a population all too familiar transgenerationally with the pains of slavery. And Romona, anything you wish to add to that slide?
For the sake of time, I think we should just continue on and move forward. We can add more. There are, in the U.S., one of the things that banks traditionally did in years back was they did a practice that was called redlining. And redlining was where bankers and managers actually sat around the table and sat in the boardrooms, and they drew red lines around certain communities, and most in particular those communities were communities of color and African American communities. And this is a map of what a red line community would look like. Earlier I talked about north of Del Mar. You can see the north of Del Mar line here. And you can see where the majority of the low-income areas are to the north of it, which is predominantly African American. Across the river to the east is East St. Louis, which is also a predominantly African American community. So it's clear that there are some injustices that are going on there. And that's what redlining typically looks like. They get very, very creative with it. The next slide, Anne, please. There are instruments of justice. Since the Civil Rights Movement, Dr. Martin Luther King, the Civil Rights Movement was enacted in 1964. The Civil Rights Act of '64 was the most sweeping civil rights legislation in the United States since Reconstruction. Then the Fair Housing Act came as in 1968, where Congress passed the act in an effort to impose a comprehensive solution to the problems of unlawful discrimination in housing based on color, race, color, sex, national origin, and religion. Later in 1977, the Congress also passed what's called the Community Reinvestment Act, which was supposed to make redlining or discrimination against neighborhoods like my neighborhood in the north side of St. Louis illegal. Well, the only thing that Vince did was got a little bit more creative in those discriminatory practices. And we'll talk a little bit more about during the presentation about that. When these instruments of justice are not effectively enforced, there are devastating results that take place simply because the laws, as America so proudly boasts of itself that America is a country of laws. Well, when those laws are not being enforced, there are devastating effects, both social and economic effects, that take place. The North Side is just one of many incidents, but that's where I live and love, so that's where we put a lot of emphasis on. Some of the results are transgenerational asset and wealth stripping, which also comes as the result of the fair housing laws not being adequately and effectively implemented. Predatory lending practices, including payday lending, decreased property values and decreased equity, gentrification and increases in rents, property taxes, the despair, more so the despair and loss of hope, increased crime, violence and incarceration rates, significant environmental injustices, and just an overall diminished quality of life. So, now we want to get a little pictorial and a little graphic for you. Beyond the Arch is what we have coined our community, because the Arch, the downtown area, is very beautiful. When visitors come, they see that part, but what they don't see is what's beyond the Arch, and that is North Del Mar. We talked about how these injustices often lead to environmental justice issues. Carter Carburetor is what's called a Superfund site in the U.S. It is a highly contaminated, chemically contaminated, obsolete manufacturing plant that used to make carburetors. And it's with highly significant toxins like PCBs, dioxins. The community did organize. We formed an advocacy group called the Carter Carburetor Citizens Advocacy Group. We challenged the Environmental Protection Agency. It's been sitting there for 40 years. It was time for it to go, and now it is coming down. This is a street that's in my neighborhood. This was a house that literally imploded, and it sat there for years before we could actually get the city to do something and take it down. This is a house, as we talked a little bit earlier about how our communities are systemically and strategically devalued. This is a house in the 4th Ward of the North Side, where the house on the right is occupied. There's a family who lives there. It's this young man's mother. His parents live there. And the house next to it is literally crumbling in on top of their home, totally stripping their home of their value and equity. Yes. We've had a lot of crime, a lot of deaths, a lot of young deaths. And one of the things that have become simple is to have monuments and memorials built, established in the community where people have lost, in particular young people have lost their lives. And this is one of those. Can you go back to that one real quick? And as you can see in the background, this is an entire street of apartment buildings, and this is what they look like, the entire block. This is the U.S. Okay. This is another block of homes in the 3rd Ward. It just so happens that one of my board members lives across the alley from this property. She is a single mother. She's raising 5 children. She's putting a daughter through Stanford University, a son through St. Louis University. She works very hard. She owns her home, but her home is being totally devalued because of this. That's right in the back of her. There are challengers, and there are people who are challenging economic injustice. Metro St. Louis Coalition for Inclusion and Equity, MSLICE, the St. Louis Regional Unbanked Task Force, which is an organization, an entity that I helped to form in partnership with the FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, the St. Louis MO Housing and Community Reinvestment Alliance. And those are local organizations, but there are also national organizations that really fight very hard on economic justice issues. One that I'm a member of is the National Community Reinvestment Coalition. And of course, when we find that those laws are not being enforced, then there are actions that we do take, legal actions that we take. We could bring in the Department of Justice, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, the new Consumer Protection Bureau, and that's the list of them. I just want to say thank you, Dr. Dominique, so much.
Thank you very much for your testimony, Romona. Thank you very much for your presentation, Anne-Sophie. We have a very good example of what countering injustice in an uncontrolled economy can allow, but also a very good example of what human willpower is capable of doing. Thank you very much for your testimony.